Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you here at the CRS Expert Seminar on Development-induced displacement, engaging intersections in the quest for solutions. As we very well know, the issue of development-induced displacement has emerged as a pertinent challenge and one which we've seen significant concerns across various contexts over the last couple of decades, and indeed statistics evidently reflect that at least 50 million people are displaced due to development projects yearly. But of course, with significant issues coming up, such as the issue of climate change and various other challenges that have emerged globally, the narrative around this pertinent subject has become an imperative to discuss, given the fact that there has been not as much attention on this pertinent issue, particularly at the global scale. And it's important to reflect and revive discussions within this context for the purpose of developing evidence solutions. And in terms of the significant challenges that emerge from it, we've seen issues around insufficient consultations, improper resettlement, inadequate compensation. And it's important to begin to build awareness around these issues. And it's against this backdrop that we are having this pertinent seminar, bringing together key experts in the field and in fact global experts, and we're indeed privileged to have them in our midst here. I'll be speaking and introducing them as they present, but I'd first like to call on our keynote presenter, Madame Cecilia Jimenez-Damary, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons. And it's a privilege to have you, Madame Cecilia, be part of us. And subject to your very kind approval, I'd like to kindly invite you to give your keynote presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, good evening, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm going back ways, but it's really my pleasure. Thank you so much, Demorala, for organizing this seminar, and also for the university to host this very small seminar. And it will hopefully be a very substantive conversation. And I take great pleasure in being in this seminar because of the fact that as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, I'm actually ending my term soon on October 31, 2022. And the last and final report that I will be giving to the UN General Assembly, half of that report will be dedicated to the issue of development-induced displacement. The reason I have chosen this theme over many themes that demand attention is also the fact that there has been very scant attention, particularly in the United Nations and the international community, on the issue of development-induced and even resettlement displacement. And I think it's really very important that we instigate some interest and policy changes with the governments and the international community in this regard. It's going to be a long haul, but I think that the work that a lot of you, for example, have been doing, and particularly the struggle at the local levels against development-induced displacement, are very important for us to give way to understand, for us to understand, and to give these people voices, especially those on the ground, so that they can be heard and their human rights protected. The guiding principles on internal displacement, which had been adopted or endorsed by the United Nations in 2000, oh my God, 18. And I think it has been very important for all of us to know that it will be the 25th anniversary of the guiding principles on internal displacement. That's going to be next year. Nevertheless, the guiding principles in internal displacement as a soft law instrument that actually contains many hard law, hard treaty law, already has a very important and accepted descriptive definition of who is an internally displaced person. And among those, people who have been forcibly or obliged, to flee their homes or places of residence due to conflict, human rights violations, violence, and natural disasters. We also see that one cause would be human-made disasters, among which would be development projects which actually result to development-induced displacement. Of course, we also know that according to the definition, there are certain exceptions with regard to the legitimacy, if you want, of a development-induced displacement. But nevertheless, this whole gamut of issue has not really been given the importance that it should be given. So development-induced displacement occurs when people are forced to leave their homes in a development form of forced migration. And the number of displaced persons and project-affected persons is growing. Overall, at least as far as conflict, violence, and natural disasters are concerned, there are almost 60 million at the end of 2021. We do not have the overall figure for development-induced IDPs. This is problematic, as some development projects are actually supposed to benefit communities or nations, but many development projects come at the cost of impoverishing and marginalizing specific communities, as forceful displacement causes a profound unraveling of existing patterns of social organization. The issue with development projects is that long-term national regional interests served by these projects cut across immediate interests of small groups and local communities. National interests usually prevail against politically weak populations. And under the GPID, we have a whole spectrum of rights that have to be protected to prevent arbitrary displacement. And we can deduce that some of these development projects may actually be classified as arbitrary displacement because of the reason that they're not legitimate or authorized by law, or do not fall into any of the exceptions with regard to public interest, and or when they do happen, the evacuation or the resettlement do not actually adhere to the standards that are in place, that are being guaranteed by the guiding principles on internal displacement. Usually the populations that are really affected would be indigenous peoples, for example, particularly once we realize that many development projects are actually undertaken in the hinterlands. Women also usually suffer disproportionately. And with regard to indigenous peoples and women, land is generally disregarded, and policymakers tend to design policies in a gender-biased way, such as recognizing only male heads as legitimate landowners, or just ignoring the people altogether. With regard to resettlement or evacuation, it is sometimes negotiated and carried out correctly, but most of the time it is not. And certainly when it comes to the housing evictions, where here we see that a lot of the demolitions happen and human rights violations then occur because the human rights guarantees are not actually respected. We have a general figure of about 15 million people displaced by development projects. However, there is no really precise data that really exists that with a very clear methodology that, for example, occurs when we talk about internally displaced persons due to conflict and violence or due to natural disasters. There are no institutions or publications dedicated to tracking development-induced displacement. There may be at some local levels, but certainly there are none at global levels. And sometimes we rely on the World Bank Environmental Department's estimate, where it has been said that 4 million have been displaced due to dam construction and 6 million due to urban development and transportation and infrastructure programs. This actually is already quite high, and it does not take into consideration other types of development projects, such as mining corporations, hydroelectric projects, etc. And I have to say that one alarming trend is that displacement caused by development projects happen more often where there are many people, and the land is actually very much needed by the development project or by the state itself. The state itself may be the one undertaking the development, or maybe complicitly doing it with the private sector. And this is also one reason why the working group on the UN working group on business and human rights and other special procedure is actually starting to look into this as well. And various types of other projects are not systematically traced, so we really have to get them on the ground. One example that I can cite is that recently a group of us special procedures actually issued a confidential, well, it was confidential at the time, it's now public, and it was a communications with regard to the forcible displacement of forest dwellers, of the Maasai tribe from the Tanzania lands because of development projects. And we sent a letter not only to the United Republic of Tanzania, but also to bring the attention of UNESCO IUCN to this situation. And it is really important that we see this. My point here is to see that development-induced displacement is not only caused by the usual dams, mining companies, etc. But there may also be other types of development projects that actually forcibly displace people. The case of the situation in Tanzania has been put on hold for a time, and hopefully that we had contributed to that, but it is also because of the work on the ground by the people themselves to stop that forcible displacement of the Maasai tribes. We also have other examples, like, for example, the dam constructions, especially in India and China. Who doesn't know about China's Three Gorges Dam project that apparently displaced around 1.2, maybe more, 1.2 million people. And that remains a prominent example of development-induced displacement. And in Africa, we also have those. Again, when it comes to the dam, aside from the example I've made in Tanzania, we also have the Akosombo Dam in Ghana. In Africa, it's also quite interesting for me, but Romola is actually, and others on the panel are actually more the experts on this. But it's interesting that we also have an additional, supposedly, protection against development-induced displacement in Africa through the Kampala Convention. While the guiding principles on internal displacement and other hard treaty law are supposed to guarantee those rights, an additional layer in Africa exists through the Kampala Convention. In Latin America and the Caribbean, as far as we know, but maybe there are other data that we really don't know, it's not as high as, for example, in Asia, but we tend to see more larger controversial resettlement operations. And we know that there are some development projects through tourism, transportation that are or have been undertaken and are in the prospect of being undertaken that will actually displace a lot of people. Again, many indigenous peoples are going to be displaced because of this. So I can go on and on with regard to this, but I think what is important right now is that what we would like to see is really to get to the bottom of how to make states, and also businesses, those who are undertaking development projects, and as well development organizations who undertake projects, and the consequences of which is forcible displacement. It is important, of course, that we ensure that we know what we're talking about, and that is the reason I really look forward to the contributions of the other panelists in this seminar, because you have been working on these issues for a long time, and I really would, we really would like to know as much as possible and learn from you. But it is very important for us from the human rights point of view, not only to be aware and to know what's going on, but also from the human rights based perspective, how to make them accountable, and of course, to prevent them in the very first place. So I would like to stop there, Romola. I think I've done my 15 minutes, and really, I am very grateful for this webinar that you have organized, and to the speakers who will be providing us their expertise so that we can learn from them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Madam Cecilia, for your pertinent reflection on this subject. And indeed, you've mentioned something very important, that it's important for us to begin to think about questions of making states, businesses, development organizations, and relevant actors, including non-states and the private sector that engage in these processes. It's important for us to think through how to ensure that they have a significant understanding of this challenge, but then more importantly, curate solutions for the purpose of realizing sustainable outcomes, particularly for development-induced displaced persons, but even in terms of prevention of displacement. Thank you so much for that pertinent comment. Very much appreciated. And I must also say that I suppose I echo the pertinent thoughts of others to say that the way in which you've introduced the narrative to us really brings a lot of perspective as we go ahead in the furtherance of discussions on these key issues. Thank you so much once more. Please would kindly like to ask that should any of us have questions, please kindly make use of the chat box to indicate your questions and engage in interactions. And it's great to already see that there are interactions in the chat box already, but please do feel free to further engage in interactions and also ask questions in the Q&A box, and then in the chat box, and then during the Q&A session, we'll be sure to raise your questions, and do let us know which of our panelists you'd like to ask the question to, for the purpose of ensuring that we could direct the questions particularly to them. Would like to move on now to the presentation by Professor Pablo Idahosa, who is a renowned global expert in the field as well, and whom some of you may already know, having engaged with his works and interacted with his pertinent scholarship, and indeed very rich as well over the last couple of decades. And evidently, he's without doubt one of the key experts in the field, and one which I'd say that his work significantly would help also bring things to perspective as we move on along in the course of the discussion. He's a professor of the Department of Social Science and college head of Founders College at York University. And he's the co-editor of the seminal work, Development, Displacement, Ecologies, Economies, and Cultures at Risk, published by the Cambridge University Press in 2011, which was also co-edited with Professor Pablo Boss, who we'll be hearing from as well shortly. I'd like to kindly invite Professor Pablo Idahosa for his pertinent lecture on development, displacement, ecology, economics, and inequity. Professor Pablo Idahosa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Romola. And I also want to thank Cecilia for her remarks, because in some sense they lay the foundation for many, I think, of the specific, substantive, and broader theoretical issues that all of us in some ways want to engage in. I should acknowledge a couple of people here. Actually, one is Pablo Boas, and another is Peter Pence, whom the two of us worked with a number of years on a SSHRC project precisely on development-induced displacement. And as you can see already, Peter has put something in the chat that reflects, I think, some of all of our misgivings about the concept development-induced displacement itself. And I think part of it lies in the context of a slightly technocratic, embedded association with institutions who in some sense have been complicit in the ways in which development is practiced globally throughout the world on the one hand, but two, who also in some sense have been part of what one wants to say, which is in fact the neoliberalization of development. And it's hard to separate out the two things when one wants to identify in some sense the points of reference, which are in some sense the political ecologies of displacement on the one hand, and on the other hand, the various kinds of inequalities and inequities that develop from it. So I would like in some ways to begin by contextualizing some of the things I want to say by evoking, in some sense, the person who has been central to much of the did and did discourse, and that's Michael Cherniack. And it's nearly 20 years ago, actually, since he actually pointed out, Cecilia, the fact that there needs to be a wider lens and discussion around the different kinds of displacement and why so-called development-induced displacement is, in some senses, a subspecies of these broader displacements that take place and the conversations within the social science literature that needs to be had. It was also, by the way, 5 years ago that he and Fernandez pointed out that the guesstimate is that there are likely to be 20 million annually people who are going to be displaced through projects that are primarily infrastructural. And when we talk about infrastructural, of course, we're talking primarily about roads, about dams, around the infrastructure relating to mining and so on, that are likely to be induced is a, how can I say, it's almost like a euphemism. And I guess this is partly what Peter is trying to get at. It's not induced, it's coerced, it's pushed. It's where people have limited choices about relocating from the place that they've had their livelihoods over a very long period of time. And of course, the focus upon infrastructure in some ways skews our understanding of the multiple sites of displacement that are going to take place. And so in some sense, it's easy to talk about the dams. It's easier to talk about the roads. And in some sense, it's skewed too, because of course, we're talking about places like China and India, where the impact and the effects of displacement are so much larger than the other places where the other forms of displacement are taking place. So you rightly point out, for example, about forestry. You rightly point out about mining, which in Africa, I know there's another speaker who's going to speak to this in a while, but I think it's important to emphasize that there is this extractivism in many, many parts of the world that are not only of the forms of development that historically are the reasons why the language, the discourse, and the practice and the institutional facets of development-induced displacement or coerced displacement or limited choice displacement, however we want to call it, have been enacted. So I think it's really important to not, in fact, focus upon dams, despite, of course, the downstream impact that it has upon ecology and environment and the downstream impact it has upon multiple communities, because it is so large. There is a kind of invisibility about displacement. And I take it that's part of what you were trying to say, Cecilia, that we don't know because there are so many facets of displacement that are now taking place that are under the radar of what we might say in this period of the neoliberal regimes of polity and economy in the context of development. So let me just briefly outline, I think, 3 areas that I'd like to people to think about. One is perhaps the overused term of land grabs. And I know that in the literature, there's a great deal of contestation over the value of that notion, right? And part of that has to do with the fact that historically there have always been land grabs, and they've been national in dimension rather than global in dimension. So really one might want to talk more about what we might call foreign expropriations of land that historically were previously under the auspices of what we might call national development. And that's linked to a whole range of factors that are not just about extractivism, but are in fact about agriculture and are about consolidations of forms of agricultural accumulation that hitherto were not necessarily on the map of a number of development projects. And some of this goes back, in fact, to the World Bank agricultural policy in the early 2000s that in some sense looked at, or rather was prescribing, consolidation of forms of agricultural development. So I think this is one area where a great deal of displacement has taken place, but which is in some sense hidden because it doesn't have the dramatic impact or effect of the usual sites of infrastructural development that most people see to understand. So it seems to me that this is one of the areas that researchers, and I have to say activists, need to do the work that others are not doing. In other words, there has to be a calculation on the part of people in the locations where this takes place to identify the sites and forms of displacement. The second, in relation to agriculture, is also linked to conflict. And this gets back in some sense to Cherny's question nearly 20 years ago, I think it was 2006 if I'm not mistaken, where he asked for a great deal more work amongst the different people doing sites and forms of displacement. So when we think, for example, of conflict-induced displacement, in other words, the violence that comes out of war, what are the sites, not just of displacement, but also expropriation at the same time? So we often think of conflict-induced displacement as sites of where there are temporary shifts, where people move from time to time to a certain place. But we know that in fact people not only move temporarily, but they move their livelihoods away from the place, right? Not just in the context of IDPs within a particular place, but beyond the countries themselves. So we can think of the masses of refugees who've had to leave, but at the same time, their lands get expropriated and get incorporated into the movement towards development practice. So whether it's of the state or others who are the beneficiaries of this conflict, then we need to see how those sites of displacement are also part and parcel, therefore, of a development project or the projects of development in that context. The third area I'd like to think about, and there's a wonderful book that came out a few years ago that's co-published by Zed and the North Africa Institute, and it's about the invisibility of migrants and refugees. And it's become one of my extended metaphors to help me understand the ways in which both refugees, but also those who are coerced into leaving, in some sense, have to engage or undergo a kind of invisibility. And one of the reasons they do that is, of course, because they become exiles in another place. It may be a place 100 miles away. It may be a place 50 miles away. But the point is, it's not their place. It's not their domicile. It's not their place of livelihood. It's someone else's. So even if they are accommodated in some way, they have to accommodate themselves in ways that they themselves induce a form of invisibility, so they do not come into conflict with the populations that they, in fact, now become a part of. So that metaphor of invisibility is something that shapes the way in which I understand a number of different facets about development-induced displacement. Let's stay with the terms of reference for the moment, even though we know it's a notion that is both contestable and in its multiple ways problematic. But at the same time, it seems to me that it's important to understand these intersections of these different processes, but also understand, and this gets back to the notion of the economies of displacement. And by economies, I don't mean the economics of displacement. That is to say, the process by which economic growth becomes the foundation by which communities and individuals are displaced, but rather the sites and the different ways in which different displacees find adjustments to where they are, right? The opportunities, the constraints, the different kinds of circumstances that they find themselves in. And so this links back then to, and it seems to me that this is part of any overlapping discussion that we need to have with respect to displacement. And this is where the political ecology comes into place. We have to historicize the communities, right? And not just see them as subjects of being displaced, but they come out of context, they come out of locations, they come out of cultures, they come out of multiple intersections of identity that are linked, yes, to their economies, the way in which they utilize the resources that they have to produce their livelihoods, but also the memories and the histories of their connections to place as well. And in that context, we need to understand not just the displacees as individual or groups of people, but as communities of people that are differentiated, and that there are differential impacts upon members of that community. And this gets back into, therefore, the issue of inequity or inequalities amongst different members of the community. So the tendency is often to see people as subjects, as if they are in some ways homogenized, right? Rather than as composites of different forms of power and authority within those communities. And so anyone who does research in these areas needs to have that sense of historicity about the subjects of the people who've been coerced or induced, to use the terms of reference, into this place, that lend themselves to a certain kind of differentiation that's absolutely necessary. My final point is that, in terms of invisibility, has to do with, when we think of displacees, we think of bodies, we think of people. We think of people who have been relocated, dislocated, dispossessed, and they carry themselves to the place that they are become the displacees to. So whether they're resettled or not, we have identifiable subjects, we have identifiable persons, and they carry with them, as I said a moment ago, their sense of selves and who they are. But part of the problem, and this gets back in partly to Peter's point, which is, in some sense, the problematic nature of the inducement itself. Because development, and this is where the problem of the development-induced discourse comes out, because it historically is linked to these massive infrastructural projects. But development is a lot more than that. That's one part of it, because we often identify development with these large projects of development. But there are other projects of development. And one of those projects of development that remain invisible, but is so fundamental to the understanding of development today, right? And let's keep in mind that development is fundamentally about intervention, right? And it has this moralistic language, this normative language about improvement, about progress, about well-being, or it's supposed to, at least. And this is our part of the justification and legitimation of projects of development. Sometimes they've been given scant usage, but that's always primarily the justification. But one of the things I'd like to know is how many people have been displaced through various forms of financialization of development. So it's a question. When we think of the subjects of development, we think of, as I say, bodies. But these bodies find themselves, in some sense, displaced in different ways. Now, it's interesting, just quickly, I'm going to finish off here because I want this to be a discussion. One, getting back to Cherny, he has, as we know, this eightfold identification of what's been lost and therefore what needs to be compensated through the risks that come from displacement. And one of them, of course, has to do with the sense of self, to put it broadly, right? But that sense of self is often assumed to move with the displacement. But there are many people who are displaced in different senses, psychologically and other ways. So I want to leave this as a thought, and it's something that I'm doing some research on. And this has to do with the displacement that comes through other sites of development. And one area I'm thinking in particular is that of microfinance. In other words, it's not a subject a body we think of people moving with, but the forms of debt that people are induced to adopt because of the financialization of development are one site of displacees. And it seems to me, I'm throwing this out as a site of a research subject that I think major institutions, those who are complicit with it, like the World Bank and other financial institutions, but also the various UN agencies, need to get a handle on as part of a project of development, but is invisible because it is not a body that moves with displacement. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pablo Hidalgo, for that pertinent lecture, and in fact, giving us a lot of food for thought. I can already see areas that are key for emerging research, but more importantly as well, very pertinent areas that we need to talk about, and the essence, in fact, of talking about these issues in very clear ways and patterns that you've given us. Thank you so much for that. Very much appreciated. And I'd just like to reiterate that I do see that I just want to thank those of us that are already using the chat box, but just to reiterate for those that probably just joined us that please kindly put questions in the chat box. And of course, after the session, we'll be having a Q&A session. And if you're comfortable with unmuting your mic and showing your video and asking your questions, that would also be appreciated. And just to say that this session is being recorded as well. Thank you very much in advance for your cooperation on this. And I'd like to now turn to Professor Pablo Boss, who is a professor at the University of Vermont and director of the Global and Regional Studies program. And he has also done extensive work on the issue of development-induced displacement and has done enormous work as well, linking this pertinent issue to climate change development projects and urbanization in the global south ecology. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, Professor Boss, with us here today to discuss development-induced displacement and climate change nexus dynamics. And you have the floor, Professor Boss.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's so nice to be here. I've really appreciated the comments already from Cecilia and Pablo. I'm always Pablo number 2. It's been really interesting listening to the comments already made, and especially some of what Pablo and Peter had brought up took me back to similar conversations we had throughout the course of the Ethics of Development-Induced Displacement project. I'm going to really briefly share my, or I'm going to use my, oh, can I share my screen? I think it's not enabled for me. Yeah, I don't think it's enabled for me. It's all right if it's not. I don't see it. Let me see if I can. Nope. Michelle, any way for me to share my screen? If not, it's fine. Oh, yep, there we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, I've been part of this longer term study of the ethics of development-induced displacement when I was at York University. I came into my interest in development-induced displacement originally really from seeing the scale of impact of displacements themselves in places like the Narmada Valley, Three Gorges, you know, especially that kind of the sense of large-scale displacement through primarily public sector projects and rural infrastructure development and things like that. And of course, as was mentioned from the outset, those kinds of more stereotypical development projects are still, you know, those concerns have not gone away. But my participation in this project, in particular in the early 2000s, led by Peter Penz, which, as you see, there's several different publications that came out of that project or adjacent to it. So the Developments, Displacements edited collection that Pablo, Peter, and I worked on really looked at a whole scale and range globally of different manifestations of development-induced displacement. The book that Peter Penz, Jay Drydick, and myself worked on really focused on the ways in which displacement itself is justified and has been justified over time, and the ways in which local communities have tried in different ways to push back against their displacement, and especially against the rationales that have displaced them as well. But what I want to talk about primarily today is really one of the things I've been really engaged with in the decade or so since I was directly involved with the DID project, which was really the area of environmentally induced displacement. And one of the things that I had found towards the end of my time working with the Development-induced displacement project was that while a dam or another project in the national good, the public good, et cetera, comes with its own set of very deep difficulties in being able to argue against one's displacement. That challenge becomes even more complicated when we look at something like a different kind of public good, something like an environmental good. And in particular, I became really interested, and as part of the Refugee Research Network, myself and Libby Lundstrom and Anna Zalek led a subgroup looking specifically at environmentally induced displacement. And we were looking at the other kinds, as Pablo and Cecilia pointed out. Development-induced displacement does not just take the form of a dam. And so what happens if it's the development project is actually conservation? What happens if the development project is urban renewal or neighborhood beautification or these other kinds of things that are seen as more directly benefiting or acting in service of a public good? How much more difficult is it then for a particular community to push back against that? So myself and Libby, as I mentioned, have been working on this for some time. We just published an article in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, specifically on environmental displacement, and which we essentially argue that there are these multiple drivers of environmental displacement connected to really centrally different notions of development itself. And this results in these kind of multiple moments of displacement. Peter asked before, this kind of, one of the challenges is not only in enumerating the number of people who are being displaced by various forms of development, but what it is that we mean not only by development, but by displacement itself, because I think it is really challenging when we fold so many different kinds of displacements under one rubric. What we argued in this particular paper was again that displacement here is not a byproduct of the Anthropocene, but in fact deeply interwoven. And this is true of this kind of different moments of how we understand development itself. So displacement, again, is not an unfortunate byproduct, but core to the moment in which we live. There's two, and I'm going to try to move really quickly through these, but there's two particular cases that I've been working on and interested in particular in this vein. And the first was one particular dynamic I became more and more focused on in the case of Bangladesh, where as I began to think about this idea of environmental displacement and its connection to development-induced displacement, I kept seeing places like Bangladesh, Bangladesh, this kind of long time touchstone of development in all sorts of ways, kind of a so-called basket case, the ground zero for microfinance of certain kinds of, and in a similar kind of way, if we look at Bangladesh's use as the canary in the coal mine again and again, well, what will happen to Bangladesh as climate change takes hold? I began to become more interested in the idea of climate change, not the effects of climate change, but rather the mitigation of climate change, mitigation and adaptation as a form of developmentalism itself. And the ways in which the kinds of displacement that we see, many of the kinds of displacement that we see in a place like Bangladesh is not about the displacement to happen as a result of climate change, but it's in fact displacement that is happening now in preparation for climate change, as forms of mitigation, as forms of adaptation. the amount of money that goes into preparing for these things is a form of developmentalism itself. And it really sort of stands out. So people displaced not by environmental processes, but rather measures to address them. I'm just going to skip by some of this. And so, as I said, I've been working with some colleagues in Bangladesh, looking at this on the ground, some of the kinds of measures that have been enacted, the preemptive displacement of especially the so-called ultra poor, the nationalization of charlands that accrete and disappear as a way of managing these processes, displacement happening over and over again, climate change as a barrier to Bangladesh's aspirations as a middle income country, and how this kind of process of displacement plays not an incidental role, but a fundamentally as a driver of development, not only of displacement. Sorry, I know I've got some random photos in here, but this was in some of the work that we had been looking at. What does climate change adaptation look like? Why is it articulated in so many ways like displacement itself? This isn't necessarily, or rather as development itself, this isn't the stereotypical ways in which we sometimes see development, which means it also doesn't even have those inadequate and incomplete measures that we think of. Who is project affected in this kind of development? How do we even think about what compensation might look like? Who is the head of a household in this kind of scenario? So even those kinds of, as I said, inadequate measures we have don't even come into play in these types of dynamics. I'm realizing I'm quickly running into 10 minutes, so I'm just going to briefly talk about one other project that I'm involved in, where again, this complicated dynamic between development, displacement, environment come to play. So I'm engaged in a lot of work on resettlement on one hand and on displacement on the other. And especially over the course of the last number of years, I've been doing a number of projects that focus on some of the largest refugee camps in the UN system. And again, knowing all of the things that we know about the fact that, you know, we only really recognize certain categories of displacees. And development is just not even in that that conversation for the most part. Environment is really inconsistently there, and climate really not at all. But as we've kind of looked at this increasing return to look at things like climate refugees and environmental refugees, and what the numbers might be, who might be impacted, affected, this question has come up around these other types of displacement. So as I said, displacement provoked by climate change, adaptation mitigation, biodiversity conservation. But this last example that I'll just close with talking a little bit about is really looking at displacements in and through the refugee camps themselves. And as we look at the context of refugee camps increasingly, as they grow in size and they grow in their permanence, right? We're no longer talking about short-term camps that you know, sort of hopefully disappear as conflicts reduce, et cetera. You know, the three camps that we've been focusing on here, you know, places like Zatari in Jordan, the Dadaab complex, and especially Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. We're talking about a camp that is now 960,000 people across multiple sites, which there's no sign of it going anywhere anytime soon. So how do we understand development in the context of a refugee camp itself? And so this work that I have been doing with a number of colleagues on the ground and in other locations has been focusing primarily on COVID-19 in the camps, multiple different kinds of risk factors within the camps themselves, public health crises, et cetera, but really has been focusing on the idea of what does development in the camp itself look like? What does displacement for those who've already been displaced in these situations? What does it mean? How do you, in Cox's Bazar, prepare not only for viral diseases, but the monsoons, a cyclone spitting up in the Bay of Bengal, mudslides, land rights and access to food, an environmental conservation project that skirts the boundaries of the camp. All of these kinds of nexus dynamics come into play. Again, looking at Cox's Bazar, Dadaab and Zatari. So I'll end here with the sort of key questions that we've been focusing on this research, like what are the nexus dynamics at play? How do you understand the interplay that when we're talking about development-induced displacement, it is not just about development, it is not just about conflict, it is not just about environment, but understanding all of these. How do we understand, coming back to Peter's question at the outset, what does displacement actually mean? What do we mean when we use that particular term? And I liked the challenge that several people raised to the question of inducement itself. What kinds of vulnerabilities take precedence or even catch our attention? How do we prioritize these different elements? And then coming back to the first question that Cecilia let us off with is, how do we imagine protection? How do we articulate, enact, and enforce protection? And again, thinking about very different kinds of communities in each of these cases. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm likely over time, and I will stop sharing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Boss. Thank you so much, Professor Boss, for those pertinent questions that you raised at the end. And I'm sure these questions will form a significant basis for interactions as well shortly after the presentations. And just to reiterate, for those that probably are joining us, do feel free to use the chat box and have discussions prior to for the questions and answers after this session. Thank you so much for that once more, Professor Boss. And I'd like to kindly moves on to Professor Preeti Narayan, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia, and is also the author of Patterns and in Arbitrariness, Resettlement Experiences of the Unrecognized Urban Poor in Chennai, which was published and edited by Routledge and was done in 2013. And just to put a personal note that Preeti and I met in 2013 during the conference on development-induced displacement organized at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford, and it's very nice to see her again after such a while. So it's great to also have you here, Preeti. Without further ado, I'd like to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Romana. It's so great to be connected again, to be talking about the IDR. Thanks also to Michelle for coordinating. I've been tasked with discussing development-induced displacement in South Asia. I feel like that's a formidable task. So I'll try and get to it from a place of knowing the things that I do know well, which is in working closely on urban displacement in India and being part of a women's rights movement that's part of a National Alliance for People's Movements in India. So one of the things that I wanted to do, many of the things that I want to talk about today resonate really deeply with the presentations and the comments that have already come up so far. Some of them I think are worth re-emphasizing, but maybe I'll start with centering those who are the most affected by development-induced projects. In India, among them, Adivasis or indigenous communities whose lands have been threatened since colonial times. And it's really interesting in that, according to multiple estimates, Adivasis constitute about 8% of the country's population, but about 40% of those who are impacted by displacement. And in urban centers, among those most affected tend to be Dalits, those who are most marginalized in the subcontinent's caste order. I want to start by sort of centering them in thinking about displacement and some of the ways in which development itself is enabled in this context. Firstly, the assumption that development indeed benefits everybody, when in fact a whole host of scholars have talked about how India's new middle class, for instance, has hegemonized popular discourse about what constitutes development, what constitutes public purpose, and so forth, in a way that the courts have also backed. Anyone who stands in the way of these projects are seen as anti-development, when in fact the public tends to imply the middle classes and the elite. And these are the constituencies to whom the benefits of development tend to go to. And I think this resonates with a lot of conversation around who sets the agenda for this mode of development, within which all sorts of projects, including conservation, beautification, eco-restoration, and so forth, are also subsumed, right, as being the appropriate actions to take in order to create world-class cities or like fastly developing nations. For instance, in 2019, the Supreme Court passed, directed various state governments to evict as many as 1 million Adivasis in the name of what particular wildlife conservation groups determined to be conservation, which meant kicking indigenous communities off of the land. And this is a way to say that it is the activities of the poor and the marginalized that are seen as selectively detrimental to the environment. For instance, in speaking about climate change, for instance, I think the connections are pretty clear that climate change has been enabled and expedited by our current developmental model. And one can think about various sort of disaster events as well. And I'd like to bring attention particularly to the floods that happened in Chennai in 2015, for instance, which was caused quite directly by virtue of urban development happening on the city's water bodies in violation of the law, which completely removed the ability of the city's rivers to absorb excess water, thus sort of drowning the city. It's interesting that the poor were at once most adversely affected, and also that in the name of disaster relief post the floods, the poor were removed forcibly from the city and resettled in the peripheries. Which brings us to the question of urban development, which is a huge, which has sort of been my focus for many years. And it's really interesting to think about all sorts of urban development projects that have resulted in the displacement of the poor, even those with legal rights to the land that they occupy. So in Chennai, one can think about officially declared slums who have legal rights to the land, but who have been displaced in the name of development. And frequently, the excuse is that there is no land in the city, and we know this to be factually untrue, right? Like these sort of speculations about how little land there is to do the many things we want to do in and with our cities, when in reality about 30 to 35% of the city's population, the poor, live on 2 to 4% of the land at the most. And this is the land that they're being denied. And even lands traditionally set aside for the poor, Panchami Bhudan lands, including lands retrieved under older land ceiling acts, when the country had more socialist sort of leanings, have all been subsumed under development projects, leaving the poor with nowhere to go. Instead, as one of the comments suggested, the poor are being criminalized. These are the people that are named encroachers and polluters, and in really selective ways, right? As if only the poor are breaking the law, when in fact, scholars like Ananya Roy have established how even the state is breaking its own laws in a bid to enable development to happen. So I guess it begs the question of what is the law, who does it serve, and how do we look at questions of legality and illegality from a more sort of nuanced perspective. So those are some things that I wanted to highlight. The other thing that I wanted to do is also kind of highlight the ways in which the marginalized are targeted for displacement, and the ways in which that tends to intersect with developmental objectives as well. And recent evictions that happened in the Jahangirpuri neighborhood in New Delhi is an example. This was a Delhi neighborhood that was reeling from communal riots earlier this year, after which these Muslim residents alone were targeted as illegal encroachers. And this when 75% of, I think the Hindu estimate said something like 75% of residential developments in New Delhi are unauthorized. And there's a selective sort of displacement of a few. So I also think that who is seen as illegal and who benefits from urban development and development projects in general cannot be removed from the ideological considerations of the people in power. And I think maybe that is something that we should begin to take more seriously, which is why the term development-induced is sort of interesting, right? Like as if development is this sort of like headless, faceless beast, when in fact, who is inducing the development? Who are the people driving urban decisions in particular directions? Cities in Gujarat, for instance, have become actively segregated in the last couple of decades, with particular urban regulations and investments going to particular parts of the city, causing others to deteriorate and causing all sorts of movements within the city as well. In some cases, evicted people tend to be resettled. And frequently this happens they are resettled to undesirable or peripheral areas of the city. In Chennai city, in the south of India, where I work, over 50,000 homes have been constructed over the last 2 decades, probably much more by now, making Chennai quite comparable to South Africa by some estimations in terms of the sheer scale of state-driven resettlement programs. Once they're moved there, residents report poor access to basic amenities, limited social infrastructure, really few employment and educational opportunities. They're cut off from major work centers. This is a clear violation of the right to life, the right to livelihood, as we argue. They're also burdened by huge down payments to move to homes that they never really wanted to move to, which brings us to the question of consent that is sort of manufactured and gained through a great deal of intimidation in instances where evictions are perhaps not outrightly violent, which is not always the case. Evictions are also frequently just violent. So this is to sort of set up the scene. And I just wanted to maybe round out with a few sort of governance considerations. And I want to talk about the World Bank in particular, which has been in some ways both a source of oppression and relief to those of us organizing on the ground, to think about how the World Bank is actively funding projects causing displacements, and this from huge dam projects, from the Sardar Sarovar, the really famous Sardar Sarovar Dam case, to a whole host of smaller urban development projects that are all evicting people. And it's been really interesting to think about the fact that, for instance, in the case of the Sardar Sarovar Dam in the 1980s, the bank approved funds despite not receiving approval from the Indian government, but it was also violating its own policy requirements relating to indigenous peoples, environmental assessments, and involuntary resettlement, and so forth. So this kind of contradiction is interesting, but at the same time, the bank has been a source of potential recourse too. We've been successful in appealing to the bank to pay closer attention to projects happening on the ground, inevitably causing more impacts than they ever estimate for. Recently, Tamil Nadu State released a draft policy on rehabilitation that made no meaningful provisions for people's participation or consultation. The policy says that a social audit has to happen 2 years after evictions rather than doing an impact assessment before development projects actually happen. And so in these instances, we appeal to international standards and to the bank's policies to say, look what they're doing, and we should be doing something similar. So it's been really interesting to think about who the bank really is as an actor and how to strategically sort of work with them or mobilize against them in order to contest displacement. But we don't have a resettlement and rehabilitation policy per se. There is one at the national level. It's being undercut vastly by the current regime. There's no systematic ways of consulting with people It's all ad hoc and sort of arbitrary, and the new policy is doing much of the same. There is no meaningful sort of devolution of powers at the local level, especially in the urban. And this is, I know that Pakistan, for instance, is also reckoning with decentralization, for instance, only being implemented partially. So I guess some of the important questions to ask is, what really happens in the case, in the event that people absolutely have to be removed for, development projects, One of the big asks has been to prevent resettlement happening to faraway locations so that people's access to livelihoods, social networks, educational opportunities, medical facilities, especially in the central city, are preserved. That's been a big ask. In fact, it was the Save Narmada movement in response to the Sardar Sarovar Dam that first made the appeal, that first championed land as compensation for land in the event of displacement. It also helped create accountability mechanisms in the bank and so forth. But we don't necessarily see land as compensation happening. Any form of compensation seems to only go to those who own the land. Tenants get left out, the landless get left out. So those are some of the impacts of development-induced displacement in this context. But a huge sort of question that's being asked by people, the National Alliance of People's Movements, which became a national level mobilization as a result of the Narmada, of the Save Narmada movement, is also really who is development for, right? We're largely depending on the trickle down or some kind of speculative trickle down benefits of a mode of development that really isn't working for the poor and the marginalized. The sort of development that we see is a sort of development that's pro-capital but anti-worker, a form of development that demands a huge precarious workforce who toil without adequate social protections in any case. And we're talking about migrant workers here who are already displaced in a sense, right? And then we saw how spectacularly they were sort of left in the lurch when the pandemic happened and lockdowns were imposed. About 11.4 million migrant workers were displaced during the time, and about 122 million Indians lost their jobs as a result. And so to also think about workers as a migrant population or a displaced population is important, and what sorts of protections that exist in order to for them to get by is sort of interesting to consider. So in asking development for whom, is there a way for us to be thinking about a form of development that doesn't ravage our environments and our people, particularly farmers, workers, and marginalized communities? I might argue that that would be the overarching question asked by people's movements, like the National Alliance. Yeah, that's probably all I have for now, and would love to continue talking about these issues.
Thank you so much, Professor Pete, for those pertinent points. And it's interesting that you raised that significant question, that who is development for? I think it's very interesting. And just to raise one very interesting chat put in by Professor Ida also, I think it's also a very significant food for thought that when we think about development-induced displacement and the narrative around this, we see that, or evidently even displacement in more general terms, we often see the paradox that the rich are never really displaced, or unless they're overthrown, or usually, of course, can find their way around within a context. But then we speak about millions of people who already have existing vulnerabilities and are further affected by these. So thank you so much for raising those points, and thank you, Professor Dehosa, and also for the pertinent points that have been raised by Professor Pence. And it's great to also have you here with us today at this lecture. So I'd like to kindly invite Mr. Unyime Eyo, who is currently working with the International Press Institute in Vienna. And prior to this, he was a staff attorney at the Justice and Empowerment Initiative in Lagos, and was part of a legal team that provided support to those displaced by urban projects in Lagos, Nigeria. But please permit me to ask those of us who have not seen the movie yet that has been shared by Professor Dehosa, please kindly probably when after this lecture, just kindly look at the movie. I think it's a very compelling story, and in fact sort of brings out some of the pertinent concerns and challenges we've been mentioning. And just to say as an aside that that movie shared with us, it's great that it was shared just in time, because Mr. Onyeme was actually also part of a legal team that worked for this group of people while he was a staff attorney at the Justice and Empowerment Initiative, and of course he would shed significant light on it. So I guess it's great that we just had the movie coming just before his presentation, and you could probably after the lecture look at the video, and it would all come together in one piece. And Mr. Onyeme will be speaking to us about resisting development-induced displacements, talking around urban social movements as activist forces. Mr. Onyeme, thank you so much for making it here today. And once more, I'd like to congratulate you on your recent accomplishments at the Central European University in Austria. Please, Mr. Onyeme, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Romola, for your kind introduction. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Center for the invitation. And then I'd also say that I've really had some very interesting thoughts here, hearing from all the panel executives speak on the subject. I think the conversation is crucial, and it is one that has not lost its significance, and the discourse actually resonates well in the African context. So very quickly, I'd just I'll speak with the sub-theme resisting development-induced displacement, just reflecting on urban social movement as activist forces, and just sharing a broad reflections in my work with the Nigerian Slum and Informal Settlement Federation, which is like kind of a movement back in Lagos, Nigeria. And outside with the background, I mean, I'd say that development-induced displacement also wears an urban face, and I think most of the conversation also occurs in the context of cities. So DOPT is the fastest growing region of the world. African cities are witnessing unprecedented waves of urbanization. One might argue that the last frontier for development rhetoric is prompting many African governments to strategically position their cities to take advantage through processes of physical urban transformation. However, I think that all of these actually come, at a very great cost, and I will explain. So, for instance, Lagos is a city where I've resided for in the last 8 years. It's governed in a neoliberal economic context, and large infrastructure projects have emerged as a popular strategy for the city to attract private capital and enhance this ambitious agenda of being Africa's model city by 2025. But evictions actually occur at the background. The urban poor who reside on squatter settlements located in prime land are subjected to evictions and subsequently displacement to make room for speculative investment. And then, just moving outside from there, I mean, in all the parts of the continent, we see how China's Belt and Road initiatives is changing our cities and but more importantly, threatening our communities, of course, with the active support of African states. BRI projects in traditional sectors like ports, roads, railways, although guised as development, have actually come with huge consequences. And for example, last year, 40,000 people in Kenya, is one of Kenya's largest slums in the capital, had their homes demolished, to make way for works for a Chinese backtoll road. And in Angola, we see Lusaka's ongoing construction boom and, a shifting urban landscape is seen as closely linked to a significant level of Chinese involvement. And the Chinese mining financing in Zimbabwe, for instance, again, has also paved way for displacement of thousands. And so all of these trends have actually, led to very pertinent questions. I mean, who has the best interest in all of these urban fantasies, these grand notions for cities? And I mean, evidently, we can actually see that in the African context, that reoccurring urbanization targeted development induces displacement, but not just inducing displacement, but also raising questions on the subject of human rights. Evictions and subsequent displacement violate due process, and they subject communities to the most dehumanizing experiences. And I mean, I would say that poor communities in cities, triggered by upward mobility, are the ones who bear the brunt of the crisis. They face interdependent realities of state violence, marginalization, and hopelessness. But these urban governmental patterns have been met rather with active resistance in some African cities, and I'll talk about that in African cities by contemporary urban social movements who challenge the status quo and seek recognition by demanding the right to the city. And I like to describe it, I mean, like, probably what David Harvey would describe as the exercise of collective power to reshape the processes of urbanization. And, and in the most engaging way, I mean, these movements have adopted the creative use of human rights language to transform consciousness, to strengthen their capacity to resist power symmetries at the root of their marginalization. And I will cite examples here. In Lagos, urban activism has birthed, different grassroots initiatives, like slum dwellers, for instance. And, just to cite one that I worked with previously, under the auspices of the Nigerian Slum and Informal Settlement Federation, initiatives such as protest, boycotts, community human rights sensitization programs, mobilizing poor city masses, have proven rather to be fertile grounds for various forms of civic engagement and the discourse, broadly in the discourse of development-induced displacement. And Felix Mocker, one of the previous former director of Social and Economic Rights Action, opined that these engagements, have offered movements a nuanced philosophy for reflective thoughts and collective action. And, as a result of that, the freedom to think, learn, agitate, to participate, to contemplate new ideas has become more contagious within these movements that we see. In Lagos, again, we see urban social movements like the Nigerian Federation joining efforts to challenge the city government on forced evictions based on developmental grounds through strategic litigation. They play a very enriching role pre-litigation, litigation, and post-litigation phases. So, for instance, when evictions occur, the movements actually increase their public engagement through regular visits to authorities, government authorities. They convene large rallies in the capital city, in Lagos, protest marches, extensive media activities also designed to garner, public attention to the situation on ground. And, through the Know Your City campaigns, it's like a subgroup under the Nigerian Federation. We've also had young people using, the creative power of media, to tell their survival stories. And more interestingly, which also, I relate so personally to is, the movement through specialized profiling teams. Within the movement, we have this special profiling teams that have helped to create data from various displaced communities. And we extract this data to draft court pleadings, more particularly in mapping out the kind of claims and damages that we seek before the courts. And so these interventions have, to an extent, have actually yielded efforts. I mean, so for instance, in 2009, on evictions that had occurred in Port Harcourt, another city in Nigeria, we had these organized movements, rallied public support to challenge the federal government of Nigeria within this Greater Port Harcourt City Master Plan. This is like a state plan that has, of course, like the same thing with Lagos, a very ambitious developmental agenda. So the organized coalitions had protested earlier, And these protests were met with fierce governmental repression and state force. But then they, brought claims, through, public interest law groups, brought claims to the ECOWAS Court of Justice on the grounds that their freedom to peaceful assembly, their right to property is guaranteed under the Nigerian Constitution, and more importantly, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights were violated. And the regional court in 2014 upheld that those claims were valid, citing that they had constitutional right to express their discontent with evictions and within the context of development in Port Harcourt City. And the court awarded damages against the government in cash, and a measure of that was actually paid by the federal government of Nigeria to the affected communities. And then we move, from a bit from Lagos, and we look at places like Nairobi in Kenya, where we have the Mungana Wanid Biji social movement of the urban poor. I've also sort of adopted, non-confrontational approach, but a strategic method of engaging the city on the discourse of evictions and displacement in the context of development. And primarily that really occurs, through governmental dialogue. The movement have been able to demonstrate that there are viable alternatives to forced evictions, that, developmental aspirations, no matter how grand they are, can still be achieved within this realm of an inclusive city. And, practices like, slum upgrading as an alternative to forced evictions have been showcased, to urban authorities with the goal of orienting the city government. And so that discourse is, very much active in the Kenyan experience. And then still running on the theme of governmental dialogue in Freetown, for instance, in Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone Federation of the Urban Poor has been crucial to providing insights to Mayor Akin Sawyer's Transform Freetown agenda. I think she happens to be one of the most active mayors in the West African city. And then they are prioritizing the needs of persons, the needs of communities that are actually prone to developmental risk. And so all of these activism goes on to affirm that communities in Africa are not just, communities in Africa are not just folding their hands, but urban movements through citizens are asserting some control over their urban environment, and they are equally resisting displacement. And this is not to say that the movement are not faced with challenges. I mean, every now and then, we're still having evictions in some places without the agency of citizens, without consultation, without any form of redress. But I think, again, these movements actually exist for a broader strategic reason, and that is to continually keep the city government in check, keep them in check, to interface when dialogue, when an opportunity for dialogue is open, to intervene with, wide range of other advocacy mechanisms, and more importantly, to preserve the right to the city for the most marginalized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Unyime, for that pertinent point, and in fact reflecting on some of the activities that have been ongoing in relation to social movement around resisting this form of displacement. Thank you so much for that, for those words. And I think this perfectly brings us to the question and answer session. I do see that we have about 34 minutes, which is great for questions and answers. And I'd just like to kindly ask those of us who have questions to kindly just indicate with a show of hands. I do see that already there have been ongoing discussions within the chat, but if you'd like to ask your question to either of our experts through unmuting yourself and also showing your video, please kindly do so now, and we'll be sure to call on you